Hello and welcome to the Clear Gospel Podcast. I'm Austin. On this show, I desire to share the message of everlasting life with people around me. It is easy, free, and clear. In this episode, I will be discussing part 1 of the most misunderstood verses in the Bible. Thank you so much for listening. So you may have noticed that Aubrey is not with me and she was not in the introduction. So I kind of want to take a minute to explain the reasons why. So I'm still doing this podcast because I believe in truth. I believe people need to hear the truth, and I want to use this platform and this ministry to reach those, especially those closer to my age. But for my wife, Aubrey, she just decided to step away for a little bit just to dedicate more time to just some house stuff, the kids, and just some things that she needed to take care of. So nothing super major or anything. But this is just a ministry I wanted to continue, and she knows this, but I truly appreciate the work and effort she did put into the first 10 or 11 episodes that we did record. So anyway, so today's topic, which I'm super excited for, I want to take the next 3 to 4 episodes to discuss the most misunderstood verses in the Bible, and this is my personal opinion. So the reason why I also just picked up this podcast again is because seminary just ended for me, and I have a little bit more time under my belt to take the time to record this. I really appreciate it that you who are listening are still with me. So this week I'm going to focus mostly on the book of Philippians. There are probably more verses than I can name on my hand that are in the Bible that are possibly very popularized and definitely misunderstood. But there are 3 main ones that I kind of found that came to my mind in the book of Philippians. So I want to take some time today to talk about that. So before we jump into these 3 verses in Philippians, I want to first kind of set the table with the book of Philippians, discuss the author, the purpose, and then go right into it. So as we know from chapter 1, verse 1, we know that Paul is the author of this letter, and it's addressed to the church of Philippi. And the purpose, as you take the time to read the 4 chapters of Philippians, this is basically a thank you letter from Paul to the Philippian church for helping financially with the gospel while Paul was in prison. And we know he was in prison for multiple reasons, but if you look in chapter 1, verse 7, there's an indication that he is in chains. And we can only assume that was during the time of his imprisonment. There are also other principles within these 4 chapters of Philippians that are very beneficial for us as believers to grow in our walk with Christ. But that's not my purpose for today. So the first verse I want to address is Philippians 1:6. But before I read Philippians 1:6, the heart of this episode and the next couple episodes is very vitally important to, one, read the entire book that you're in and also read it in context. Context. So Philippians 1:6 says, being confident of this very thing, that he who has begun a good work in you will complete it until the day of Jesus Christ. So the reason why I personally believe this is probably one of the most misunderstood verses is a lot of people assume this verse means people who are saved eternally will persevere in good works until the end. And I want to spend a little bit of time talking about how that is not what this verse is referring to. So I'm going to read verses 3 through 7 to kind of read around 1 through 6 to get some context. So starting in verse 3, it says, I thank my God upon every remembrance of you, always in every prayer of mine, making requests for you all with joy, for your fellowship in the gospel from the first day until now, being confident of this very thing, that he who has begun a good work in you will complete it until the day of Jesus Christ. Just as it is right for me to think this of you all, because I have you in my heart, and as much as both in my chains and in the defense and confirmation of the gospel. So we know that the good works that is in verse 6 is referring to the Philippian church's fellowship with Paul. And specifically the way that they were in fellowship is, number one, they had a really close relationship with Paul. Paul was in the presence of them. And of course, when he's writing this letter, he's in prison. We don't know where. We assume it's in Rome and maybe another place. We don't know. But we do have an indication in chapter 4, 15 through 16, that this fellowship did imply more than just the personal level. So starting at 15, it says, now you Philippians know also that in the beginning of the gospel, when I departed from Macedonia, no church shared with me concerning giving, talking about financial giving, and receiving, but you only. So this is what I meant at the very beginning. Paul's just addressing them and saying thank you for their financial support, just with their fellowship in the gospel. And this is enabling Paul to share the gospel with others. God will finish his work until the judgment seat of Christ. So if you look at the end of verse 6, it says, will complete until the day of Jesus Christ. That's referring to the judgment seat of Christ, where all believers will be judged based on the things we do in this life. Not based on eternal salvation, but based on the works that we do and the way we continue in the faith. So, what's interesting too about the verse 15 and 16, the Philippian church was the only church to support him at that time, at least in the writing. We do know that good works do not play a part in receiving eternal life. One needs to believe or be convinced that what Jesus says is true. He who believes in me has everlasting life. And I've already addressed this previously in other episodes with the Gospel of John. But a lot of people pull verse 6 to say that if you are eternally secured, you will persevere in good works until the very end of your life. And that is not what Paul's addressing in verse 6. It is also worthy to note that their ministry has benefited not only us, and I say us as in like believers, but the readers of this letter from Paul. I mean, this letter has been around for, my guess is 1,000, 2,000 years. Because of their financial support to Paul, Paul was able to continue his ministry, but also the very fact that we have this book in the Bible shows that their financial giving will be rewarded one day at the judgment seat of Christ, which goes back to, at the very end of verse 6, will complete it until the day of Jesus Christ. So that's something worthy to note. The next verse is Philippians 2:12. Wherefore, my beloved, as you have always obeyed, not as in my presence only, but now much more in my absence. Work out your own salvation with fear and trembling. Most people use this as, I guess, I need to work out my salvation throughout my life, and they're referring to, I guess, their eternal salvation. But I want to break down this verse as well. So this is, when it talks about salvation, the Greek word is soteria. This is equivalent to sanctification, or to being made holy. Paul is encouraging this church to continue in the faith, even in his absence. So Paul was like with them. That's what he indicated. You obeyed in my presence, talking about Paul being with this church, but he's encouraging them, when I'm not with you, I encourage you to continue in the faith with fear and trembling. And why that's very important is because right before verse 12, Paul discusses that Jesus was obedient to the Father even unto death, and God highly exalted him, referring to Jesus. We as believers in the same way are encouraged to continue in the faith. And that's what Paul's trying to encourage this church. Because one day we will be before the judgment seat of Christ, which is where an evaluation of our things we do in this life as believers. And that ties right back into a verse that came to mind, 2 Corinthians 5, 9 through 11. Therefore we make it our aim, whether present or absent, to be well-pleasing to him. For we must all appear before the judgment seat of Christ, that each one may receive the things done in the body according to what he has done, whether good or bad, knowing therefore the terror of the Lord we persuade men. But we are well known to God, and I also trust are well known in your conscience. So what he's saying here also in 2 Corinthians, this is Paul talking again, we should have a little bit of fear and trembling of what that judgment day will look like. Now, like I said, it has nothing to do with their eternal destiny, but it has to do with reward in the kingdom to come. And he's trying to encourage the Philippians to continue in the faith because he wants them to have reward in the kingdom, and encouraging them to continue in the faith. Because those who fall away, as Hebrews talks about. Those are ones that potentially forfeit their reward in the kingdom. So that's all I have to say with that verse. The very last verse, which is probably the most famous in Philippians 4:13, I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. So, as you can probably guess, you've seen this in most homes, maybe sketched on a pillow, some type of wall framing. You've seen it just about everywhere, maybe on a t-shirt. But what's worthy to note is people who quote this, I know for a fact they probably have good intentions. And I want to just take a minute to address, what people see with Philippians 14 versus what does the context actually tell us. So, as I mentioned before, this was written to believers in the church of Philippi, and Paul mentions he's already received their gift in chapter 4, which I brought up in, I think, verse 14 or 15 or 16, and he's very thankful for their fellowship in the gospel and their financial support. So, what's very worthy to note, and I'm going to read a couple of verses before you get to Philippians 4:13, starting in verse 10, it says, "But I rejoice in the Lord greatly that now at last your care for me has flourished again, though you surely did care, but you lacked opportunity. Not that I speak in regard to need, for I have learned in whatever state I am to be content." That's a key phrase, to be content. "I know how to be abased, and I know how to be abound. Everywhere in all things I have learned both to be full and to be hungry, both to abound and to suffer need." And then the next verse is 13. So what's very interesting is the word abase. It's a similar meaning of having very little. So Paul experienced having very little, and he also explained having very plentiful, the word abound. Also, what's interesting when I was digging through this, chapter 4, verse 12, notes, I know how to be abased, and I know how to be abound. In other words, he's comparing that, hey, I know what it's like to be plentiful, and I know what it's like to be, in other words, suffering. Because he also goes on to say that everywhere in all things I have learned both to be full and in hungry. So he understands the comparison of having a lot versus having a little, and even to the degree of hungry, which is his version of suffering in this case. But here's the thing that's very vitally important for 4:13. Paul is talking about contentment in all circumstances. The modern view of Philippians 4:13, which they have good intentions, they use it flippantly to say, I can do all things through Christ. I can, win this game. I can win the lottery. And it has nothing to do with that. It has to do with being content. And what's interesting is Paul says Philippians 4:13, I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. He knows that he has strength through Christ despite any circumstance he's gone to, whether he has the most or has very little, whether he's doing well or he's suffering like he is in prison right now. And he's learned just to be content with all things. So that's something that's very interesting to think about. And we'll continue this episode next week with part 2. But if you really enjoyed this episode, give us a thumbs up and subscribe. If you enjoyed our content, feel free to share our channel with others. Our next episode, I will be talking about part 2 of most understood verses in the Bible. Remember, don't just take it, test it.